All right. Chapter 6 Talons and Tea Leaves. When Ron, Harry, and Hermione entered the Great Hall for breakfast the next day, the first thing they saw was Draco Malfoy, who seemed to be entertaining a large group of Slytherins with a very funny story. As they passed, Malfoy did a ridiculous impression of a swooning fit, and there was a roar of laughter. "Ignore him," said Hermione, who was right behind Harry. "Just ignore him. He's not worth it." "Hey, Potter!" shrieked Pansy Parkinson, a Slytherin girl with a face like a pug. "Potter! The Dementors are coming, Potter! Woo!" Harry dropped onto a seat at the Gryffindor table next to George Weasley. "New third-year timetables," said George, passing them over. "What's up with you, Harry?" "Malfoy," said Ron, sitting down at George's other side and glaring over the Slytherin table. George looked up in time to see Malfoy pretending to have a faint with terror again. "That little git," he said calmly. "He wasn't so cocky last night, when the Dementors were down our end of the train. Came running into our compartment, didn't he, Fred?" "Nearly wet himself," said Fred, with a contemptuous glance at Malfoy. "I wasn't too happy myself," said George. "They're horrible things, Dementors." "They freeze your insides, don't they?" said Fred. "You didn't pass out, though, did you?" said Harry in a low voice. "Forget it, Harry," said George bracingly. "Dad had to go out to Azkaban one time. Remember, Fred? He said it was the worst place he'd ever been. He came back all weak and shaking. They suck the happiness out of a place, Dementors. Most of the prisoners go mad in there." "Anyway, we'll see how happy Malfoy is after our first Quidditch match," said Fred. "Gryffindor versus Slytherin, first game of the season, remember?" The only time Harry and Malfoy had faced each other in a Quidditch match. Malfoy had definitely come off worse. Feeling slightly more cheerful, Harry helped himself to sausages and fried tomatoes. Hermione was examining her new timetable. "Oh, good, we're starting some new subjects today," she said happily. "Hermione," said Ron, frowning, as he looked over his shoulder, "they've messed up your timetable, look. They've got you down for about 10 subjects a day. There isn't enough time." "I'll manage. I fixed it all with Professor McGonagall." "But look," said Ron, laughing. "See this morning? 9 o'clock, divination, and underneath, 9 o'clock, muggle studies." And Ron leant closer to the timetable with a disbelieving look. "Look, underneath that, arithmancy, 9 o'clock. I mean, I know you're good, Hermione, but no one's that good. How are you supposed to be in 3 classes at once?" "Don't be silly," said Hermione shortly. Of course I won't be in 3 classes at once." "Well then, pass the marmalade," said Hermione. "But—" "Oh, Ron, what's it to you if my timetable's a bit full?" said Hermione. "I told you I fixed it all with Professor McGonagall." Just then Hagrid entered the Great Hall. He was wearing his long moleskin coat and was absent-mindedly swinging a dead polecat from one enormous hand. "All right," he said eagerly, pausing on the way to the staff table. "You're in my first lesson, right after lunch. Been up since 5 getting everything ready. I hope it's okay. Me, a teacher, honestly." He grinned broadly at them and headed off to the staff table, swinging the polecat. "I wonder what he's been getting ready," said Ron, a note of anxiety in his voice. The hall started to empty as people headed off towards their first lesson. Ron checked his timetable. "We'd better go, look. Divination's at the top of the North Tower. It'll take us 10 minutes to get there." They finished their breakfast hastily, said goodbye to Fred and George, and walked through the hall. They passed the Slytherin table. Malfoy did yet another impression of a fainting fit. The shouts of laughter followed Harry into the entrance hall. The journey through the castle to the North Tower was a long one. 2 years at Hogwarts hadn't taught them anything about the castle. If 2 years at Hogwarts hadn't taught them anything about the castle, and they had never been inside the North Tower before. "There's got to be a shortcut," Ron panted, as they climbed their 7th long staircase and emerged on an unfamiliar landing. There was nothing but a large painting of a bare stretch of grass hanging on a stone wall. I think it's this way, said Hermione, peering down the empty passage to the right. Can't be, said Ron. That's south. Look, you can see a bit of the lake out of the window. Harry was watching the painting. A fat, dapple grey pony was just ambling onto the grass and grazing nonchalantly. Harry was used to the subjects of Hogwarts paintings moving around and leaving their frames to visit one another, but he always enjoyed watching them. A moment later, a short, squat knight in a suit of armour that clanked into the picture after his pony. By the look of the grass stains on his metal knees, he had just fallen off. Aha! He yelled, seeing Ron, Harry, and Hermione. What villains are these that trespass upon my private lands? Come to scorn at my fall, perchance? Draw, you knaves, you dogs! They watched in astonishment as the little knight tugged the sword out of its scabbard and began brandishing it violently, hopping up and down in a rage. But the sword was far too long for him. Particularly wild swing made him overbalance, and he landed on the grass. Are you all right? Said Harry, moving closer to the picture. Get back, you scurvy braggart! Back, you rogue! The knight seized his sword again and used it to push himself back up, but the blade sank deeply into the grass, and although he pulled with all his might, he couldn't get it out. Finally, he had to flop back onto the grass and push up his visor to mop his sweating face. Listen, said Harry, taking advantage of the knight's exhaustion. We're looking for the North Tower. You don't know the way, do you? A quest! The knight's rage seemed to vanish instantly. He clanked to his feet and shouted, Come follow me, dear friends, and we shall find our goal, or else shall perish bravely in the charge. He gave the sword another fruitless tug, tried and failed to mount the fat pony, and cried, On foot then, good sirs, gentle lady, on, on! And he ran, clanking loudly to the left-hand side of the frame and out of sight. They hurried after him along the corridor, followed by the sound of his armour, or following the sound of his armour. Every now and then they spotted him running through a picture ahead. Be stout of heart, the worst is yet to come, yelled the knight, and they saw him reappear in front of an alarmed group of women in crinolines, whose picture hung on the narrow wall of a spiral staircase. Puffing loudly, Harry, Ron, and Hermione climbed the tightly spiraling steps, getting dizzier and dizzier, until they heard the murmur of voices above them, and they knew they'd reached the classroom. Farewell, cried the knight, popping his head into the painting of a sinister-looking monk. Farewell, my comrades in arms. If ever you need the noble heart and steely sinew, call upon Sir Cadogan. Yeah, we'll call you, muttered Ron as the knight disappeared, if we ever need someone mental. They climbed the last few steps and emerged onto a tiny landing where most of the class was already assembled. There were no doors off this landing. Ron nudged Harry and pointed at the ceiling, where there was a circular trapdoor with a brass plaque on it. Sybil Trelawney, divination teacher, Harry read. How are we supposed to get up there? As though in answer to his question, the trapdoor suddenly opened, and a silvery ladder descended right at Harry's feet. Everyone went quiet. After you, said Ron, grinning, so Harry climbed the ladder first. He emerged into the strangest-looking classroom he had ever seen. In fact, it didn't look like a classroom at all, more like a cross between somebody's attic and an old-fashioned tea shop. At least 20 small, circular tables were crammed inside, all surrounded by chintz armchairs and fat little buffets. Everything was lit with a dim crimson light. The curtains at the windows were all closed, and many lamps were draped with dark red scarves. It was stiflingly warm, and the fire which was burning under the crowded mantelpiece was giving off a heavy, sickly sort of perfume as it heated. What's my husband doing? in the frame. I'll warn him he's on camera. Sorry about this. Well, at least he was clothed this time. Aye, where were we? Ron appeared at Harry's shoulder as the class assembled around them, talking in whispers. Where is she? Ron said. A voice suddenly came out of the shadows, a soft, misty sort of voice. Welcome, it said. How nice to see you in the physical world at last. Harry's immediate impression was of a large, glittering insect. Professor Trelawney moved into the firelight, and they saw she was very thin. Her large glasses magnified her eyes to several times their natural size, and she was draped in gauzy spangling uh, in a gauzy spangled shawl. Innumerable chains and beads hung around her spindly neck, and her arms and hands were encrusted with bangles and rings. Sit, my children, sit, she said, and they all climbed awkwardly into armchairs or sank into buffets. Harry, Ron, and Hermione sat themselves around the same table. There's a lot of Harry, Ron, and Hermione's throughout this, isn't there? Have you noticed? Should have got a wee counter for it. Welcome to divination, said Professor Trelawney, who had seated herself in a winged armchair in front of the fire. My name is Professor Trelawney. You may not have seen me before. I find that descending too often into the hustle and bustle of the main school clouds my inner eye. No one said anything in answer to this extraordinary pronouncement. Professor Trelawney delicately rearranged her shawls and continued. So you've chosen to study divination, the most difficult of the magical arts. I must warn you at the outset that if you do not have the sight, there is very little I will be able to teach you. Books will only take you so far in this field. At those words, both Harry and Ron glanced, grinning at Hermione, who looked startled at the news that books wouldn't help much in this subject. Many witches and wizards, talented though they are in the area of loud bangs and smells and sudden disappearings, are yet unable to penetrate the veiled mysteries of the future, Professor Trelawney went on. Her enormous, gleaming eyes moved from face to nervous face. It is a gift granted to few. You, boy, she said suddenly to Neville, who almost toppled up off his buffet. Is your grandmother well? I think so, said Neville tremulously. I wouldn't be so sure if I were you, dear, said Professor Trelawney. The firelight glinted on her long emerald earrings. Neville gulped. Professor Trelawney continued placidly. We will be covering the basic methods of divination this year. The first term will be devoted to reading tea leaves. Next term we shall progress to palmistry. By the way, my dear, she shot at Parvati Patil. Beware a red-headed man. Parvati gave a startled look at Ron, who was right behind her, and edged her chair away from him. In the summer term, Professor Trelawney went on, we shall progress to crystal balls. If we have finished with fire omens, that is. Unfortunately, classes will be disrupted in February by a nasty bout of flu. I myself will lose my voice. And around Easter, we will lose one of our number forever. A very tense silence followed this pronouncement, but Professor Trelawney seemed unaware of it. I wonder, dear, she said to Lavender Brown, who was the nearest, and shrank back in her chair, if you could pass me the largest silver teapot. Lavender looked relieved, stood up, and took the enormous teapot from its shelf and put it down on the table in front of Professor Trelawney. Thank you, my dear. Incidentally, that thing that you're dreading, it will happen on Friday the 16th of October. Lavender trembled. Now, I want you to divide into pairs. Collect a teacup from the shelf. Come to me, and I will fill it. Then sit down and drink. Drink until only the dregs remain. Swill these around your cup 3 times with your left hand, and then turn the cup upside down in its saucer. Wait for the last of the tea to drain away, and then give your cup to your partner to read. You will interpret the patterns using pages 5 and 6 of Unfogging the Future. I shall move along you, helping and instructing. Oh, and dear, she caught Neville by the arm as he made to stand up. After you've broken your first cup, would you be so kind and select one of the blue patterned ones? I'm rather attached to the pink. Sure enough, Neville had no sooner reached the shelf of teacups than there was a tinkle of breaking china. Professor Trelawney swept over to him, holding a dustpan and brush, and said, One of the blue ones then, dear, if you wouldn't mind, thank you. When Harry and Ron had filled their teacups, they went back to their table and tried to drink the scalding tea quickly. They swilled the dregs around as Professor Trelawney had instructed, then drained the cups and swapped them. Right, said Ron, as they both opened their books at pages 5 and 6. What can you see in mine? A load of soggy brown stuff, said Harry. The heavily perfumed smoke in the room was making him feel sleepy and stupid. Broaden your minds, my dears, and allow your eyes to see past the mundane, Professor Trelawney cried through the gloom. Harry tried to pull himself together. Right, you've got sort of a wonky cross, he said, consulting Unfogging the Future. That means you're going to have trials and suffering. Sorry about that. But here's the thing that could be the sun. Hang on. That means great happiness. So you're going to suffer, but be happy. You need your inner eye testing, if you ask me, said Ron, and they both had to stifle their laughs as Professor Trelawney gazed in their direction. My turn. Ron peered into Harry's teacup, his forehead wrinkled with effort. There's a blob a bit like a bowler hat, he said. Maybe you're going to work at the Ministry of Magic. He turned the teacup the other way up. But this way it looks more like an acorn. What's that? He scanned a copy of Unfogging the Future. A windfall. Unexpected gold. Excellent. You can lend me some. And there's the thing here. He turned the cup again. That looks like an animal. Yeah, that was its head. It looks like a hippo. No, a sheep. Professor Trelawney whirled around as Harry let out a snort of laughter. Let me see that, my dear, she said reprovingly to Ron, sweeping over and snatching Harry's cup from him. Everyone went quiet to watch. Professor Trelawney was staring into the teacup, rotating it anti-clockwise. The falcon, my dear, you have a deadly enemy. But everyone knows that, said Hermione in a loud whisper. Professor Trelawney stared at her. Well, they do, said Hermione. Everyone knows that about Harry and you-know-who. Harry and Ron stared at her with a mixture of amazement and admiration. They'd never heard Hermione speak to a teacher like that before. Professor Trelawney chose not to reply. She lowered her eyes into Harry's cup again and continued to turn it. The club, an attack. Dear, dear, this is not a happy cup. I thought it was a bowler hat, said Ron sheepishly. The skull, danger in your path, my dear. Everyone was staring, transfixed at Professor Trelawney, who gave the cup a final turn, gasped, and then screamed. There was another tinkle of breaking china. Neville had smashed his second cup. Professor Trelawney sank into a vacant armchair, her glittering hand at her heart, her eyes closed. My dear boy, my poor dear boy. No, it's kinder not to say. No, don't ask me. What is it, Professor? Said Dean Thomas at once. Everyone had got to their feet slowly as they crowded around Harry and Ron's table, pressing close to Professor Trelawney's chair He had a good look at Harry's cup. My dear, Professor Trelawney's eyes, huge, opened dramatically. You have the grim. The what? Said Harry. He could tell he wasn't the only one who didn't understand. Dean Thomas shrugged at him, and Lavender Brown looked puzzled, but nearly everyone else clapped their hands to their mouths in horror. The grim, my dear, the grim, cried Professor Trelawney, who looked shocked that Harry hadn't understood. The giant spectral dog that haunts churchyards. My dear boy, it is an ill omen, the worst omen of death. Harry's stomach churned. That dog on the cover of Death Omens in Flourish and Blots, the dog in the shadows of Magnolia Crescent. Lavender Brown clapped her hands over her mouth too. Everyone was looking at Harry, everyone except Hermione, who had gotten up and moved around the back of Professor Trelawney's chair. I don't think it looks like the Grim, she said flatly. Professor Trelawney surveyed Hermione with mounting dislike. You'll forgive me for saying so, my dear, but I perceive very little aura around you, very little receptivity to the resonances of the future. Seamus Finnegan tilted his head from side to side. It looks like a Grim if you do this, she said, or he said with his eyes almost shut. It looks more like a donkey from here, he said, leaning to the left. When you've all quite finished deciding whether or not I'm going to die, said Harry, taking himself by surprise. Now no one seemed to want to look at him. I think we'll leave the lesson here for today, said Professor Trelawney in her mistiest voice. Yes, please pack away your things. Silently, the class took their teacups back to Professor Trelawney, packed away their books, closed their bags. Even Ron was avoiding Harry's eyes. Until we meet again, said Professor Trelawney faintly. Fair fortune be yours. Oh, and dear, she pointed at Neville, you'll be late next time, so mind you work extra hard to catch up. Harry, Ron, and Hermione decided that Professor Trelawney's ladder, or descended Professor Trelawney's ladder and the winding staircase in silence, then set off for Professor McGonagall's transfiguration lesson. It took them so long to find her classroom that, early as they had left divination, they were only just on time. Harry chose a seat right at the back of the room, feeling as though he was sitting in a very bright spotlight. The rest of the class kept shooting furtive glances at him, as though he was about to drop dead at any moment. They hardly heard what Professor McGonagall was telling them about animagi, wizards who could transform themselves at will into animals, and wasn't even watching when she transformed herself in front of their eyes into a tabby cat with spectacle markings around her eyes. Really, what's gotten into you all today? Said Professor McGonagall, turning back into herself with a faint pop and staring around them all. Not that it matters, but the last time my transfiguration got applause from the class. Everyone's heads turned towards Harry again, but nobody spoke. Then Hermione raised her hand. Please, Professor, we've just had our first divination class, and we're all reading tea leaves and... Ah, of course, said Professor McGonagall, suddenly frowning. No need to say any more, Miss Granger. Tell me, which of you will be dying this year? Everyone stared at her. Me, said Harry finally. I see, said Professor McGonagall, fixing Harry with her beady eyes. Then you should know, Potter, that that Sybil Trelawney has predicted the death of one student every year since she arrived at this school. None of them has died yet. Seeing death omens is her favourite way of greeting the new class. If it were not for the fact that I never speak ill of my colleagues, Professor McGonagall broke off, and they saw that her nostrils had gone white. She went on, more calmly. Divination is one of the most imprecise branches of magic. I shall not conceal from you all that I have very little patience for it. True seers are very rare, and Professor Trelawney... She stopped again, and then said in a matter-of-fact tone, You look in excellent health to me, Potter, so you will excuse me if I don't let you off homework today. I assure you that if you die, you need not hand it in. Hermione laughed. Harry felt a bit better. It was harder to feel scared of a lump of tea leaves, anyway. away from the dim red light and befuddling perfume of Professor Trelawney's classroom. Not everyone was convinced, however. Ron still looked worried, and Lavender whispered, "But what about Neville's cup?" When the Transfiguration class had finished, they joined the crowd, thundering towards the Great Hall for lunch. "Ron, cheer up," said Hermione, pushing a dish of stew towards him. "You heard what Professor McGonagall said." Ron spooned the stew onto his plate and picked up his fork, but didn't start. "Fork for stew?" "Harry," he said in a low, serious voice, "I haven't seen, you haven't seen a great black dog anywhere, have you?" "Yeah, I have," said Harry. "I saw one the night I left the Dursleys." Ron let his fork fall with a clatter. "Probably a stray," said Hermione calmly. Ron looked at Hermione as though she'd gone mad. "Hermione, if Harry's seen a Grim, that's bad," he said. My my Uncle Bilious saw one, and he died 24 hours later." "Coincidence," said Hermione airily, pouring herself some pumpkin juice. "You don't know what you're talking about," said Ron, starting to get angry. Grims are Grims scare the living daylights out of most wizards." "There you are, then," said Hermione in a superior tone. "They see a Grim and die of fright. The Grim's not an omen, it's the cause of death. And Harry's still with us because he's not stupid enough to see one and think, right, well, better pop my clogs then." Ron mouthed wordlessly at Hermione, who opened her bag and took out her new arithmetic book, propped it open against the grape juice. "I think divination seems very woolly," she said, searching for her page. "A lot of guesswork, if you ask me." "There's nothing woolly about a Grim in that cup," said Ron hotly. You didn't seem quite so confident when you were telling Harry it was a sheep." Hermione said coolly. "Professor Trelawney said you didn't have the right aura. You just don't like being rubbish at something for a change." He had touched a nerve. Hermione slammed her arithmetic book down on the table so hard that bits of meat and carrot flew everywhere. "If being good at divination means I have to pretend to see death omens in lumps of tea leaves, I'm not sure I want to be studying it much longer. That lesson was absolute rubbish compared to my arithmetic class." She snatched up her bag and walked away. Ron frowned after her. "What's she talking about?" he said to Harry. "She hasn't been to an arithmetic class yet." Harry was pleased to see. Harry was pleased to get out of the castle after lunch. Yesterday's rain had cleared. The sky was clear, pale grey, and the grass was springy and damp underfoot as they set off for the first ever Care of Magical Creatures. Ron and Hermione weren't speaking to each other. Harry walked beside them in silence as they walked down the sloping lawns to Hagrid's hut on the edge of the Forbidden Forest. See, this is what happens if I go on for too long. Start losing my concentration, don't I? Uh, Forbidden Forest. It was only when he spotted three only too familiar backs ahead of them that he realised that they must be having lessons with the Slytherins. Malfoy was talking animatedly to Crabbe and Goyle, who were chortling. Harry was quite sure that he knew what they were talking about. Hagrid was waiting for his class at the door of his hut. He stood in his moleskin overcoat, with Fang, his boarhound, at his heels, looking impatient to start. "Come on now, get a move on," he called, as the class approached. "Got a real treat for you today. Great lesson coming up. Everyone here? Right, follow me." For one nasty moment, Harry thought that Hagrid was going to lead them into the forest. Harry had had enough unpleasant experiences in there to last him a lifetime. However, Hagrid strolled off around the edge of the trees, and 5 minutes later they found themselves outside a kind of paddock. There was nothing in there. "Everyone gather round the fence here," he said. "That's it. Make sure you can see. Now, first thing you'll want to do is open your books." "How?" said the cold, drawling voice of Draco Malfoy. Eh? Said Hagrid. How do we open our books? Malfoy repeated. He took out his copy of the Monster Book of Monsters, which had been bound shut with a length of rope. Other people took theirs out too. Some, like Harry, had bolted their books shut. Others had crammed them inside their bags tight, or clamped them together with bull clips. Hasn't hasn't anyone been able to open their books? Said Hagrid, looking crestfallen. The class all shook their heads. You've got to stroke them, said Hagrid, as though this was the most obvious thing in the world. Look. He took Hermione's copy and ripped off the sellotape that bound it. The book tried to bite, but Hagrid ran a giant forefinger down its spine, and the book shivered and then fell open and lay quiet in his hand. Oh, how silly we've all been, Malfoy sneered. We should have stroked them. Why didn't we guess? I I thought they were funny, Hagrid said uncertainly to Hermione. Oh, tremendously funny, said Malfoy. Really witty, giving us books that try to rip our hands off. Shut up, Malfoy, said Harry quietly. Hagrid was looking downcast, and Harry wanted Hagrid's first lesson to be a success. Right then, said Hagrid, who seemed to have lost his thread. So, so you got your books, and now you need the magical creatures. Yeah, so hang on, and I'll go get them. He strode away from them into the magical forest and out of sight. This place is going to the dogs, said Malfoy loudly. That oaf teaching classes. My father'll have a fit when I tell him. Shut up, Malfoy, Harry repeated. Careful, Potter, there's a Dementor behind you. Oh, squealed Lavender Brown, pointing towards the opposite side of the paddock. Trotting towards them were a dozen of the most bizarre creatures Harry had ever seen. They had the bodies, hind legs, and tails of horses, but the front legs and wings and heads of what seemed to be giant eagles, with cruel, steel-cutted beaks and large, brilliant orange eyes. The talons of their front legs were half a foot long and deadly looking. Each of the beasts had thick leather collar around its neck, which was attached to a long chain, and the ends of these were held in the vast hands of Hagrid, who came jogging to the paddock behind the creatures. Gee up there, he roared, shaking the chains and urging the creatures towards the fence where the class stood. Everyone drew back slightly as Hagrid reached them and tethered the creatures to the fence. Hippogriffs, Hagrid roared happily, waving his hand at them. Beautiful, aren't they? Harry could sort of see what Hagrid meant. Once you got over the shock of seeing something that was half horse, half bird, you started to appreciate the hippogriffs' gleaming coats, changing colour smoothly from feather to hair, each of them a different colour: stormy grey, bronze, pinkish roan, gleaming chestnut, inky black. So, said Hagrid, rubbing his hands together and beaming around, if you want to come a bit nearer. No one seemed like they wanted to. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, however, approached the fence cautiously. Now, first thing you gotta know about hippogriffs is that they're proud, said Hagrid. Easily offended, hippogriffs are. Don't ever insult one, 'cause that might be the last thing you do. Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle weren't listening. They were talking in an undertone, and Harry had a nasty feeling they were plotting on how to best disrupt the lesson. You always wait for the hippogriff to make the first move, Hagrid continued. It's polite, see? You walk towards him, and you bow, and you wait. If he bows back, you're allowed to touch him. If he doesn't bow, get away from him sharpish, 'cause those talons hurt. Right, who wants to go first? Most of the class backed away further in answer. Even Harry, Ron, and Hermione had misgivings. The hippogriffs were tossing their fierce heads and flexing their powerful wings. They didn't seem to like being tethered like this. No one, said Hagrid with a pleading look. I'll do it, said Harry. There was an intake of breath from behind him, and both Lavender and Parvati whispered, Oh no, Harry, remember your tea leaves. Harry ignored them. He climbed over the paddock fence. Good man, Harry, roared Hagrid. Right then, let's see how you get on with Buckbeak. He untied one of the chains and pulled the grey hippogriff away from its fellows and slipped off its leather collar. The class on the other side of the paddock seems to be holding its breath. Malfoy's eyes were narrowed maliciously. Easy now, Harry, said Hagrid quietly. You got eye contact. Now, try not to blink. Hippogriffs don't trust you if you blink too much. Harry's eyes immediately began to water, but he didn't shut them. Buckbeak had turned his great, sharp head and was staring at Harry with one fierce orange eye. That's it, said Hagrid. That's it, Harry. Now bow. Harry didn't feel like exposing the back of his neck to Buckbeak, but he did as he was told. He gave a short bow and then looked up. The hippogriff was still staring haughtily at him. It didn't move. Ah, said Hagrid, sounding worried. Right, back away now, Harry. Easy does it. But then, to Harry's enormous surprise, the hippogriff suddenly bent its scaly front knees and sank into what was unmistakably a bow. Well done, Harry, said Hagrid, ecstatic. Right, you can touch him. Pat his beak. Go on. Feeling that a better reward would have been to back away, Harry moved slowly towards the hippogriff and reached out towards him. He patted the beak several times, and the hippogriff closed his eyes lazily, as though enjoying it. The class broke into applause, all except for Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle, who were looking deeply disappointed. Right then, Harry, said Hagrid. I reckon he might let you ride him. This was more than Harry had bargained for. He was used to a broomstick, but he wasn't sure a hippogriff would be quite the same. You climb up there, just behind the wing joint, said Hagrid, and mind you don't pull any of his feathers out. He won't like that. Harry put his foot on top of Buckbeak's wing and hoisted himself onto his back. Buckbeak stood up. Harry wasn't sure where to hold. Everything in front of him was covered in feathers. Go on then, roared Hagrid, slapping the hippogriff's hindquarters. Without warning, 12-foot wings flapped open on either side of Harry. He just had time to seize the hippogriff around the neck before he was soaring upwards. It was nothing like riding a broomstick. Harry knew which one he preferred. The hippogriff's wings were beating uncomfortably on either side of him, catching him under his legs and making him feel like he was about to be thrown off. The glossy feathers slipped under his fingers, and he didn't dare get a stronger grip. Instead of the smooth action of his Nimbus 2000, he now felt himself rocking backwards and forwards as the hindquarters of the hippogriff rose and fell with his wings. Buckbeak flew him once around the paddock and then headed back to the ground. This was the bit Harry had been dreading. He leant back as the smooth neck lowered, feeling he was going to slip off over his beak, and then felt the heavy thud as the 4 ill-assorted feet hit the ground, and just managed to hold on and push himself back up straight. Good work, Harry, roared Hagrid, as everyone except Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle cheered. Okay, who else wants a go? Emboldened by Harry's success, the rest of the class climbed cautiously into the paddock. Hagrid untied the hippogriffs one by one, and soon people were bowing nervously all over the paddock. Neville ran repeatedly backwards from his, which didn't seem to want to bend its knees. Ron and Hermione practiced on the chestnut while Harry watched. Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle had taken over Buckbeak. He had bowed to Malfoy, who was now patting its beak, looking disdainful. This is very easy, Malfoy drawled, loud enough for Harry to hear him. I knew it must have been if Potter could do it. I bet you're not dangerous at all, are you? He said to the hippogriff. Are you, you ugly great brute? It happened so fast. In a flash of steely talons, Malfoy let out a high-pitched scream, and the next moment Hagrid was wrestling Buckbeak back into his collar as he strained to get at Malfoy, who lay curled on the grass, blood blossoming all over his robes. I'm dying, Malfoy yelled as the class panicked. I'm dying, look at me, it's killed me. You're not dying, said Hagrid, although he'd gone very white. Someone help me. Gotta get him out of here. Hermione ran to open the gate. while Hagrid lifted Malfoy easily. As they passed, Harry saw that there was a long, deep gash in Malfoy's arm. Blood splattered the grass where Hagrid ran with him, up the slope to the castle. Very shaken, the Care of Magical Creatures class followed a walk, or at a walk. The Slytherins were all shouting about Hagrid. They should sack him right away, said Pansy Parkinson, who was in tears. It was Malfoy's fault, snapped Dean Thomas. Crabbe and Goyle flexed their muscles threateningly. They all climbed the stone steps into the deserted entrance hall. I'm going to see if he's okay, said Pansy, and they all watched her run up the marble staircase. The Slytherins, still muttering about Hagrid, headed away in the direction of their dungeon common room. Harry, Ron, and Hermione proceeded upstairs to the Gryffindor Tower. Do you think he'll be all right? Said Hermione nervously. Of course he will. Madame Pomfrey can mend cuts in about a second, said Harry, who had had far worse injuries mended magically by the matron. Mended magically by the matron. That was really a bad thing to happen in Hagrid's first class, though, wasn't it? Said Ron, looking worried. Trust Malfoy to mess things up for him. They were among the first to reach the Great Hall at dinner time, hoping to see Hagrid, but he wasn't there. They wouldn't sack him, would they? Said Hermione anxiously, not touching her steak and kidney pudding. They'd better not, said Ron, who wasn't eating either. Harry was watching the Slytherin table. A large group, including Crabbe and Goyle, were huddled together, deep in conversation. Harry was sure they were cooking up their own version of how Malfoy got injured. Well, you can't say it wasn't an interesting first day back, said Ron gloomily. They went up to the crowded Gryffindor common room after dinner and tried to do the homework Professor McGonagall had set them. Oh my goodness. Oh, it's my PC running low on battery. Oh, how long do we have left? Oh, it's only a page or so. Just Malfoy domestics up from interesting day back. There was a light on at Hagrid's window, said Harry suddenly. Ron looked at his watch. If we hurried, we could go down and see him. It's still quite early. I don't know, Hermione said slowly, as Harry saw her glance at him. I'm allowed to walk across the grounds, he said pointedly. Sirius Black hasn't got past the Dementors here, has he? So they put their things away and headed out of the portrait hole, glad not to meet anyone on their way to the front doors. As they weren't entirely sure that they were supposed to be out, the grass was still wet and looked almost black in the twilight. When they reached Hagrid's hut, they knocked, and a voice growled, "Come in." Hagrid was sitting in his shirt sleeves as he scrubbed the wooden table. His boarhound Fang had his head in Hagrid's lap. One look at them told them that Hagrid had been drinking a lot. There was a pewter tankard, almost as big as a bucket, in front of him, and he seemed to be having difficulty getting them into focus. "'Spect it's a record," he said thickly when he recognized them. "Don't reckon they've ever had a teacher who only lasted a day before." "You haven't been sacked, Hagrid?" gasped Hermione. "Not yet," said Hagrid miserably, taking a huge gulp of whatever was in the tankard. "But it's only a matter of time, isn't it? After Malfoy." "How is he?" said Ron, and they all sat down. "It wasn't serious, was it?" Madame, Madame Pomfrey fixed him the best she could," said Hagrid dully. "But he's saying it's still agony, covered in bandages, moaning." "He's faking it," said Harry at once. "Madame Pomfrey can mend anything. She regrew half my bones last year. Trust Malfoy to milk it for all it's worth." "School governors have been told, of course," said Hagrid miserably. "They reckon I started too big. Should have left hippogriffs for later. Dumb flobber worms or summat. Just thought it'd make a good first lesson. It's all my fault." "It's all Malfoy's fault, Hagrid," said Hermione earnestly. "We're witnesses," said Harry. "You said the hippogriffs would attack you if you insult them. It's Malfoy's problem he wasn't listening. We'll tell Dumbledore what really happened." "Yeah, don't worry, Hagrid. We'll back you up," said Ron. Tears linked out of the crinkled corners of Hagrid's beetle-black eyes. He grabbed both Harry and Ron and pulled them into a bone-breaking hug. "I think you've had enough to drink, Hagrid," said Hermione firmly. She took the tankard from the table and went outside to empty it. Aye, maybe she's right, said Hagrid, letting go of Harry and Ron, who both staggered away, rubbing their ribs. Hagrid heaved himself out of his chair, followed Hermione unsteadily outside. They heard a loud splash. What's he done? Said Harry nervously, as Hermione came back with an empty tankard. Stuck his head in a barrel of water, said Hermione, putting the tankard away. Hagrid came back, his long hair and beard sopping wet, wiping water out of his eyes. That's better, he said, shaking his head like a dog, drenching them all. Listen, it was good for you to come and see me. I really. Hagrid stopped dead, staring at Harry as though he only just realised he was there. What do you think you're doing, eh? He roared so suddenly that they jumped a foot in the air. You're not to go wandering around after dark, Harry, and you too letting him. Hagrid strolled over to Harry, grabbed his arm, and pulled him out the door. Come on, Hagrid said angrily. I'm taking you back up to the school, and don't let me catch you walking down here after dark again. I'm not worth that. End of chapter 6. All right, we'll leave it here. I've got about probably 20 seconds until my laptop dies. 5% power. That's probably deceiving. No, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for listening, and see you soon.